to Solo Ship Week 6. I'm Squirrel Patrol. I'm joined by JMtoWin from 1 week season. JM, I'll go first on week 5.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever had a week where I was right on so much stuff and then still had a really bad week. I think I said, I think my hot take last week was HN would rush for 11 or 120 yards on 12 carries, and that would lower his rushing yards per attempt or whatever. And he went 150 on 12 carries, raised his rushing yards per carry. So I was right on the hot topic of the week or whatever. But ultimately just too much Anthony Richardson and too much Justin Jefferson. And not enough Jamar Chase. And so on these, it ended up being one of those binary weeks. It was just well, how much Jamar Chase do you have? And then everything else.
Yeah. And at the same time, it takes one roster. I've had so many weeks where maybe I didn't have the best week of play, but I got that one roster that hit. And so I had 12% Jamar Chase. I was comfortable being underweight on him. And I've had weeks where, my 12% guy, if I get a lot of other things right, they line up on the right roster in some place. And I use that roster in a couple single entry tournaments, and it still ends up being a really nice weekend. But yeah, the way you described week 5 is like a mirror of my week, where it was kind of oh, I really didn't get anything wrong. I was underweight Jamar Chase, but I didn't really get anything wrong. Quarterback was kind of wrong for most people across the board. So my quarterbacks weren't great, but that was pretty common for most rosters. Didn't miss anybody who had a big game, and yet had 3 out of my 150 rosters finish in the money in the slant. So it was actually the easiest week of the season for me to turn the page on, because it was I didn't play poorly and things just didn't line up for me this week, and turn the page to the next one.
Yeah, I kind of go into NFL season knowing, Joe Mixon week last year, that there's going to be some weeks where I'm a little bit or maybe even dramatically under the field on somebody that just goes berserk, and it's not going to be my week. And sometimes it can be because I'll do 150 lineup sets, and I'm very rarely completely fading players.
Exactly. Yeah.
Any amount of ownership. So it was I wasn't dramatically under the field on Jamar Chase. I just didn't have him on the right rosters, and that ultimately sucked my week.
Yeah, same thing. And we live to fight another day. It helps when you have we both had a good start to the season. So then that just reminds you it was easy for me to say, okay, did I do anything differently in week 5? Did I mail it in week 5? Did I change my process? Was I looking at different things? Was I overthinking things, underthinking things? And I was no, I followed the same process. It just was one of those weeks. You have them, and makes it easy to be cool, well, just move on to the next one.
Yeah, absolutely. This week, I'm a little bit surprised, just looking around at some of the content this week, that I think there's a big story of the week, and it's not really, nobody's presenting it as a big story. I think the overriding story this week that most people are talking about is well, you've got a bunch of games that have about the same point totals, so that makes it an interesting week and a difficult week. I always look at implied point totals more than game totals. And I think the Dolphins are standing out above everybody else. And I'm surprised that we're not talking about more Dolphins chalk and how do you get off the Dolphins? If anything, I think the Rams game seems to be more popular. And I think the story of the week is that the Dolphins have an implied point total is I think 10% higher than any other team on the slate, which second is the Rams. I think it's 25% higher than the third highest team, which I think is the Jaguars. And then you have a bunch of teams that are kind of floating around, even going back and forth in 24 or 24 and a quarter or 24 and a half. I'm going to be jamming my rosters full of Dolphins players this week and trying to figure out everything else after that. I don't normally have that strong of a take on a week, especially on a Friday.
Interesting. So when you're jamming in Dolphins, that's really 3 guys, right? Okay.
Well, so, I think it's obviously Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle. There are the receivers. Don't really have a ton of interest in anybody else. Although I think Chase Claypool, I haven't even looked to see if he's eligible on the slate yet. But I remember reading some quote about Chase Claypool and thinking, well, that would be an interesting, really low owned, 150, 1 in 150 kind of play. And then it's Raheem Mostert. And then I'm interested in Jeff Wilson if it looks like Wilson's going to get activated. If Wilson's not activated, I would have some interest in Ahmed or Savin Ahmed.
Yeah. Savin Ahmed. Yeah.
And then Tua's not really getting talked up that much. I mean, I think Matthew Stafford's going to see a ton of ownership. And then I think you'll see, especially some of the cheaper quarterbacks on DraftKings, the $5,000 guys, they'll get some ownership. I think Joe Burrow will see a lot of ownership. I don't see why people would play somebody other than Tua. I'll have plenty of Matthew Stafford on my 150 set. Like I would think that the week would start and end with the Dolphins and Tua, and people just aren't going there. And I know it could all be running game too, but it could also be Tua passes a yard to Mostert, who then runs for 80 yards.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting angle. I haven't been super hung up on the Dolphins myself. I think that, there's been talk in our group text thread on OWS, me and Hilo and Mike and Zandamir, of a couple of them have been like, oh, you got to play one Dolphin on every roster this week. And I haven't really been gravitating toward that myself because it's hard for me to see, not hard for me to see. It's easy for me to see the ways that the expensive pass catchers don't exceed, like go well over 30 points against a really good Panthers pass defense. Now, the argument that I've made on the other side of that in my head, kind of working through the spot, is there's a difference between, as I pointed out throughout the season, there's a difference between being the Patriots pass defense and seeing this Dolphins team for the third time, or the Bills pass defense seeing this Dolphins team for the fourth time since the start of last season, and being the Panthers pass defense. And yes, you're a really good pass defense, but you're seeing this speed in real time for the first time. It can be harder to adjust to that. So yeah, I could see it's just, for me, I guess it's funny because I came into this thinking there's a spot that I'm on that I thought that you were going to be very much in sync with me on, which you might be when I get to it. But it's easy for me to see Hill having like a solid game, but it's hard for me to see the Panthers keeping pace. So it's hard for me to see them throwing enough for Hill to get to like 35 or 40 points. And then with Mostert, like I like Mostert a lot, but we know that the volume is less predictable than it seems, which is why you said Jeff Wilson and Salvon Ahmed. That last year there were games when Jeff Wilson saw more snaps and more touches than Raheem Mostert. And so yeah, I'd kind of like it if Wilson's healthy, because it would feel like, well, they're like the ownership on Mostert might go down a little bit, but then these guys are coming back from injury, so Mostert still probably sees 65% or something like that. But no, I mean, Mostert's on my list, Tyreek's on my list. I don't gravitate toward Waddle as much as maybe you do or some other people do, but wouldn't like argue against him. But they're also not like my starting point on my rosters this week, I guess, is the way I'm looking at it. So yeah, I like that. I like it because typically we come together and we're very much aligned on how we're attacking things. And then you'll have like that little 5%, 8% that I'm like, oh, I hadn't thought of that, and I'll pull it in. So this is like a big block that I'll have to kind of pull into my thoughts and see how that fits with how I'm seeing things.
I think they just might be doing something that's like transformative in the NFL, where I did a show with Blender this morning. He described it as like watching, maybe the Denver game, the game against Denver, where it looked like a lopsided college football matchup. And that's actually like the perfect call, because those lopsided college football matchups happen because one team just has like physical abilities that the other team doesn't have. It might be a powerhouse Division I school against a school that's not investing as much in their football program. But the Dolphins have like created those physical mismatches in the NFL with their speed. One of the fastest teams I've seen in live NFL action. And speaking of live NFL action, more memories are made when you're there for live NFL action. And when you need tickets, Ticketmaster has got you covered. As the official marketplace of the NFL, Ticketmaster gives you more ways to find your perfect seat. Their interactive seat map gives you 360-degree previews of your section to make sure you have the best view of those pivotal plays. And if your plans change, Ticketmaster gives you more flexibility to sell or transfer your tickets. Plus, mobile tickets make getting in on game day a breeze, and you can even customize your Ticketmaster app to rep your team's colors. Find tickets today at Ticketmaster.com/NFL. But yeah, so I think the Dolphins actually remind me a little bit of the Golden State Warriors when they in basketball, when they just started shooting 3-pointers and people thought, well, this isn't sustainable. And guys averaging 10 yards per rush isn't sustainable. But like actually with the speed, I don't know. And so my thought process is maybe I want to be overweight Miami the rest of the season until they prove otherwise, right? And if they start, and maybe against some matchups, maybe against the Jets defense, I'm not going to want to necessarily be like so far over the field on them but maybe I want to aim to be, as a general game plan, be overweight them the rest of the season until I'm proven wrong.
No, I like that thought process. I remember that the 2017 Astros that turned out they were cheating, but I was saying all that year, it was like you could literally just play stack the Astros every day and you would make money, because if it was a bad pitcher, sure, everybody was on them, but you would be overweight and they would have those 10-run games. And if it was a good pitcher, they'd get him out by the 5th or 6th inning. They would have only scored 2 runs. Then all of a sudden they're putting up another 8 runs in the 7th, 8th, and 9th innings. They would hit doubles, they would steal. And like, yeah, you find those offenses, those teams that it's like, well, you can just always bet on this and it's never wrong. And I definitely agree with you that the Dolphins are that team. And it's a slate where, well, you mentioned how much higher their implied team total is than the other spots on the slate. But it's like a slate where there's nothing else that's like, oh, this team could go for 35 points. This team could go for 42 points. Like the teams that are capable of scoring a bunch of points generally are not in spots that are conducive to a lot of points being scored. So, not against that. It just isn't kind of where my head had been. So, I like this conversation for sure.
Yeah. I think the spot that a lot of people are going to is the Rams. I think Matthew Stafford's going to see a ton of ownership. And I'm not, I will probably have as much Matthew Stafford as I have any other quarterback, maybe after Tua. I'm not against the play. Like I said, this morning, I think that, you can score fantasy points by running up and down the field, getting yards and touchdowns. You can also get receptions. And the Rams seem really good at that. And so, Cooper Kupp, Puka, Kyron Williams, and, I think you compare any of that with Matthew Stafford. I do think, though, people are catching on to Arizona. I think Joshua Dobbs was a kind of a sneaky play we talked about last week. I think he ended up being the highest owned quarterback in the $4,000 DraftKings Millionaire Maker.
People are watching our show.
Yeah, maybe. But I mean, part of it was me. I think I had 2 teams with him. I didn't play a ton of entries in that. I had a bunch of tickets. I had one from satellites. I played 2 Joshua Dobbs rosters. But then actually my highest cashing team was a Matthew Stafford roster that, of course, had a Jamar Chase run back. So I think it actually touches, I think the 2 popular teams are going to be the Rams and the Bengals, which I'm not against. I don't have like a bunch of negative things to say about them. But to whatever extent it takes away from Miami ownership, that's fine with me.
Yeah, I mean, they're in the same category in terms of what those quarterbacks are. They're same as Tua, right? They're pocket passers. They might pick up 1 to 2 points on the ground. They might pick up 0 points on the ground. So it's all about how many yards and touchdowns do they get. So if you take away game environment and the potential that the Dolphins just blow the doors off of the Panthers, is Tua, and take price tags off, like is Tua likelier to put up 300 yards and 4 touchdowns than these guys? Yeah. Like, is he likelier to put up 300 yards and 3 touchdowns than these guys? I don't know that he necessarily is, but in terms of like how many, if we played out this slate 100 times, how many times would Tua throw for 4 or 5 touchdowns compared to these other guys? I think that he would do that more often. So I see that argument. Like, I think that the likeliest outcome, Stafford and Burrow are very sharp plays. But in terms of like, what are the outlier outcomes? You're not probably getting an outlier outcome where Burrow's throwing for 5 touchdowns or where Stafford's throwing for 5 touchdowns, whereas you could get that with Tua for sure.
Yeah, it is interesting. There's not a ton of rushing quarterbacks on the slate this week that I can think of. I think, Justin Fields is the guy, but I think there could be some weather in that Minnesota-Chicago game. And so I think I'm going to be under the field on that. I think the point total has dropped since the beginning of the week. I think some of that might be natural, and Justin Jefferson not playing in the game. But I think some of it could be weather concerns as well. Although I guess that doesn't affect his rushing upside. But there's not as much opportunity cost. Doesn't feel like a quarterback. There's also Jalen Hurts, but he's facing a Jets defense and he's the most expensive quarterback on the slate. So I think I'll end up over the field on Jalen Hurts. I don't think he'll see as much ownership as is currently being projected because of the game total and because of the implied point total on the Eagles is a little bit lower than it usually is. And so I think I'll play Jalen Hurts probably what I'm seeing his projected ownership as right now, and I think I'll be over the field on him.
Yeah, I think Hurts is interesting. I think, again, I asked the question, what are his chances of burying me? What are his chances of going for 35? Or what are his chances of, if he's on my roster, me burying people who didn't play him? I think obviously you've got to say pretty low against the Jets defense, but he can still get there. The guy I haven't heard you mention that I thought we would be in sync on is your boy, Desmond Ridder, playing against a Washington defense that's bottom 2, bottom 3 in pass defense DVOA, pretty solid against the run. We know that they like to run the ball, but Desmond Ridder has 31 or more pass attempts in 4 consecutive games, including games of 37 and 38 pass attempts. We know that he can add some rushing upside, has a game with 10 carries for 39 yards and a touchdown, has a game with 10 rushing yards and a touchdown. And, Drake London fundamentally is one of the most underpriced pieces on the slate, as are the tight end, Jonnu Smith in particular, but Jonnu Smith and Kyle Pitts. So I think that's an interesting spot. That and the Josh Dobbs spot are ones where it's like, oh, these guys, like, it wouldn't shock me if we come out of the weekend and Tua threw for 302 or 303 and has about 27 points, and Hurts has about 25 to 27 points. And one of these cheap guys with some rushing upside ends up putting up 25 points for way less than salary and opens up a lot on your roster. So I like the angle of hitting on Dobbs, hitting on Ridder this week as well.
So yeah, Desmond Ridder did me wrong on the Detroit game. I'm having a hard time going back. I will say that when we're out of sync on something, I will say it's almost always a FanDuel versus DraftKings bias. Because I think you're a little bit more on DraftKings. I'm a little bit more on FanDuel. I think Ridder is 6,800 on FanDuel. And I just don't see that kind of upside. It's possible. It's a game a couple people have brought up to me, as a game that could go over its total. It's actually my pick on the RotoGrinders expert survey is the game that could go over its total by the most points. But I could also just see like Atlanta isn't going to throw the ball if they don't have to. So it could be, I like playing Bijan Robinson and the Atlanta defense being over the field on that. And I'm sure I'll have some Desmond Ridder, especially on DraftKings in like my multi-entry build. It's just tough on FanDuel, and he's going to score better on FanDuel. But he's also just relatively more expensive on FanDuel, whereas that like 5,000 price tag on DraftKings when he hits, and if he's getting like rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, and he's connecting with Drake London, and Drake London's always way too cheap. But like Drake London can also see 0 targets and 0 receptions because the Falcons are just going to run the ball unless you force them to do otherwise. And I don't know that Washington can force them to do otherwise.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at it like I think that it's easy to perceive Washington versus Atlanta the way we would have perceived it last year. But Washington is by far one of the most aggressive offenses in football this year under Eric Bieniemy. And 3 out of 5 games for Washington have combined for 60-plus points. 4 out of 5 games they've allowed 30-plus points to their opponent. Obviously, Atlanta tends to be a shootout suppressor, but they are capable of having these higher scoring games. So, I mean, I think it's one of those spots similar to the Tua spot where I hadn't been on it as much as you because I had been in my head arguing the downside of it, but you can also make a very clear and sharp case to the upside. And I think that Ridder and this Falcons passing attack is a similar thing in that it's easy to embrace the downside argument, but then also there's this other side that's like, oh, and most people won't see this other side. I mean, I think maybe both of us end up expanding our exposure on those 2 spots, and trading that off a little bit because, I mean, I think that both of those are very interesting. And on a slate where Matthew Stafford and Joe Burrow are the ones that on paper stand out the most to people, right? And it's like, well, these guys don't run the ball and they need to hit the 300-yard bonus and throw 3 touchdown passes just to hit 27 points. Why not look at those running quarterbacks or the guys like Tua who could throw 5 touchdown passes as kind of like the outlier production that you might be able to get? So
you mentioned Cincinnati. Do you think you'll be underweight the field there, overweight the field? I was thinking it's actually something I talked over with Blender this morning, but he brought up the idea of playing Geno Smith. And I'd actually mentioned that I can see like Joe Burrow or I see Jamar Chase hitting again, absolutely, especially if T. Higgins sits. But then that means you need Jamar Chase. It doesn't necessarily mean you need Joe Burrow. It's like, I don't see why people wouldn't play Geno Smith. That is an interesting way of stacking that game of maybe playing Geno Smith because if he's hitting with his wide receivers and you add Jamar Chase to that, or you could even add Joe Mixon, then that's an interesting way of playing that game that's getting much less ownership. And I was thinking, that I'm going to end up over the field, I think, on Geno Smith more than I would have, just to kind of cover some of that Joe Mixon and Jamar Chase ownership that I don't necessarily want to buy into with Joe Burrow.
Yeah. So where am I going to be on Cincinnati ownership? I haven't looked at ownership projections this week, and I haven't hit a point in my process where I've needed to, but I understand that those guys will be popular. I would imagine I'll be underweight Jamar Chase if he's like 30%, because it does look like T. Higgins is going to play. Yet I think that we'll still see heavy Jamar Chase ownership, but I'll also have plenty of Jamar Chase. I could have zero Joe Mixon. And that's been, Joe Mixon's looked so bad. People are like, oh, the usage. Well, that was the same thing we were saying all year last year. And there was one game where he went above 20 points, and sure, it went for 55, but that Seattle's number 2 in the NFL in run defense DVOA. So this is not me telling you, the viewer, don't play Joe Mixon. I'm just saying what I'm doing. I don't because I look at what I'm seeing first before I look at what's being said on the outside. So if a player is just not in my pool from my research, and I tend to put my research up against anyone's, right? So I'm like, if a player is not in my pool based on my research and then they're high owned, I look at that as over time, that's the Joshua Kelly against the Titans type setup, right? Where it's there's going to be every once in a while where this player goes off and I lose that week because of it. But way more often than not, that player is a less good play than the ownership says. And so I make money over time. So Mixon just hasn't been in my pool. And the fact that he's going to be popular doesn't change. Maybe he ends up on 4% of my large field play to account for the fact that he's so popular. But he's not a guy I'm after. And then I like the Geno side. And that's kind of on my end. It's Burrow is the quarterback on paper, but I'll have some trailing Geno rosters that are basically saying in this game environment, if it's all about where the touchdowns come from, right? Nobody really looked at Jared Goff last week because it's so hard to pass against the Panthers, so easy to run against the Panthers. The Lions like to run the ball. Goff only had 240 passing yards, but he gets 4 touchdowns. I think it was 3 through the air, 1 on the ground. All of a sudden, he puts up one of the top GPP scores. So all it takes is Burrow not accounting for as many touchdowns as Geno Smith, and all of a sudden Geno's the better play there. So I would imagine I'll be, I'll have somewhat heavy Burrow ownership, maybe even the field, maybe a little bit above, depending on what the field does. But I'll have probably significantly more than the field has of Geno, just because if I'm betting on a game environment, I'm going to loop that bet in all the way around.
So one of the stories this week that's kind of shaping up, especially starting today, is value at their running back position. And that's actually something that I've kind of written into my Dolphins content, is that I know they're expensive, but I think we're going to see some value popping up throughout the week. We're seeing that with Miles Sanders now not expected to play. We know that James Conner is out. I think the question is which of the Arizona running backs is going to see more opportunity. And then it's very likely that Chicago is down to their third string running back, Dante Foreman, if both Roshan. Well, I think Khalil Herbert's definitely out, and Roshan Johnson is in the concussion protocol and seems unlikely to play. Any thoughts on the value running backs?
Yeah, I'm. There's two sides. I'm not against it. I'll say it like this: the 6K. Well, actually, the 6K running backs are a little bit better than the 6K wide receivers, but the 6K running backs are less strong ways to spend salary than the 5K wide receivers. You know what I mean? Just the way that running back is used in the NFL these days. And if there were 8K running backs on this slate, it's better to pay for the 8K wide receivers than the 8K running backs. So from a standpoint of saving salary at running back to spend it at wide receiver, that's sharp. At the same time, we've seen cheaper wide receivers put up 20, 25, 30-point games. Chuba Hubbard's been in the lead role plenty of times before. His best career DraftKings game, I think it's 21.4 points. Realistically, he's probably getting 13 to 16 points, which at his salary, that's great. And that opens up salary elsewhere. But if that takes away a roster spot that could get 30 points, right? So I might gravitate more toward DeAndre Swift, Raheem Mostert, Alvin Kamara, Bijan Robinson, these guys who could get you 20, 25, 30, and then maybe your Josh Downs and Drake London and Adam Thielen and DJ Moore, like these guys who aren't the super expensive wide receivers, maybe you can get 20 to 30 points from some of these guys. And it actually ends up being a better roster construction as a whole. So I'm not like just jumping on these cheap running backs because they save salary, because also if they put up a 12 to 14 point game, that is still taking away an upside spot. But Chuba Hubbard is the one who stands out the most. Deontay Foreman, you got to rely on obviously touchdowns and yardage. So that's a harder sell, but he's fine. And then if Keontae Ingram is out, I like Amari DeMarcado quite a bit because he'll step into that James Conner role. If Keontae Ingram plays, then you're like, it's a backfield that's typically going to score 20 points or less, split between two guys. You don't really know how the split's going to work out. So that one's not as appealing to me if Keontae Ingram is active. You got any thoughts on those spots that kind of are different from mine?
I'm probably a little bit higher on Chuba. He's pretty cheap. I mean, he's I think 4,300 on DraftKings, and I think below 6,000 on FanDuel. And if he's getting like most of the work, like that's a pretty good price for a running back that I feel pretty confident is going to get a lot of the work. Arizona, I'd like to be higher on the guys, but there's two of them. And we don't know where it's going to go. And it's a situation where historically I feel like they have given more of the work to one running back, but we just don't know which one it's going to be. And it wouldn't be surprising to me if it's one of those situations where the coach is talking up one guy, he sees the first series, the second guy sees the second series, does well, and it's just him the rest of the game. And the starter that everybody's on is the guy that puts up 3 points, and then the backup puts up 20. It's like, oh, we should have known. So that's a situation I'm likely to stay away from unless it really does come down to one running back, in which case I might have some interest there. And then I could end up seeing myself playing like a double running back value build because there's actually not a lot of value at wide receiver this week. It's basically Robert Woods, who I'm probably going to be playing a lot of because he's like 3,800 on DraftKings, and it looks like Tank Dell is out. And after that, there's not a whole lot of value at wide receiver.
Yeah, I mean, I think Josh Downs is a really sharp play. He's averaging 9.7 pre-touchdown DraftKings points per game, which means that he should be priced in about the 5K range. Gardner Minshew is going to be able to get him the ball. So he's a sharp play, I think sharper than Robert Woods. Nothing against Robert Woods. Curtis Samuel also, based on what he's done so far this season in the Eric Bieniemy offense, he actually should be priced in the low 5K range, and he's still priced at 3,700. Rashid Shaheed can always hit for a big game. So there are some other guys who are interesting. Jonathan Mingo has been on the field basically every snap when he's been healthy. He has games of 5, 6, 7, and 8 targets, only averaging 6.1 pre-touchdown DraftKings points per game, hasn't scored a touchdown yet. So he's a little bit more thin, but yeah, I do think there are some value pieces. And with Robert Woods, he's still the number 3 in a bad matchup because the season started. Now Noah Brown is healthy. The season started with Noah Brown as the number 2. And my bold call in week 2 was that with Noah Brown hurt, Tank Dell wasn't giving back the starting job. But it's either going to be John Mechie, who they're going to say he's ready, which then he would see more looks than Robert Woods, or it's going to be Noah Brown because he was the starter to start the season. So yeah, no, I don't mind Robert Woods, but I think that his ownership is going to be inflated above his likeliest output. But I mean, I think there's probably a little bit more value. KJ Osborne, 4,400. Drake London, 4,800, where you're not getting all the way down to 4,300 at Chuba, but there's a little bit more value at wide receiver maybe than the field will give it credit for, and guys who could outscore Chuba. So I don't mind that roster construction approach and maybe getting a couple running backs who could score 25 to 30. At the same time, no, I'm not against Chuba Hubbard. I just think that there's like some interesting angles to play around with in terms of how you put these rosters together this week. I'll have some Chuba, but I like the idea of double pay down because then you're getting really unique and you're able to sort of jam in multiple of these 8K guys. And then, maybe some of the 5 and 6K guys who are still underpriced for where they really should be.
Jonathan Mingo down as a value piece sounds like an interesting run back for my high priced Dolphins.
There you
go. Yeah. So another game I wanted to touch on that 2 of the most disappointing teams in the league so far. But one of them has a very concentrated offense. One of them might have no offense at all. The Patriots and Raiders. Do you see yourself getting to a lot of Josh Jacobs, Devontae Adams, Jacoby Myers, and Mac Jones.
And Mac Jones. I've built a couple Mac Jones rosters that I like, and I have to balance that and be like, well, like Mac Jones isn't going to run, so he needs the 303 or at least the 302, but ideally the 303. But he's coming off games against three of the top defenses in the NFL, in New Orleans and the Jets and the Cowboys. And all of those, these early turnovers that just put them in a hole and made them a one-dimensional team. So my drawback with the Patriots, because I would not then there's all this swirling stuff about Belichick's going to get fired. Like, you don't think this team has a chance to come out on fire and actually looking good against the Raiders defense, right? Like, will people be surprised if that happened? The problem is not only do you have to be right in the Patriots having a good game, then you have to be right about it coming through the air instead of on the ground. And then even if you get both of those right, you have to guess a team that spreads the ball around. You have to guess the guy who will actually get the usage. So it's you could get the bet right that the Patriots surprise people, and then that still leaves your roster in the dust because of how many other things have to fall into place. So there's a lot of guesswork on that play, but I do like that game. I think that, just Jacobs from a usage and talent standpoint, I don't like taking offensive pieces against the Patriots, especially running backs, but from a usage and talent standpoint, he's interesting. Jacoby Myers is interesting. Devontae Adams is interesting. The Patriots side of the ball is interesting. So, yeah, I don't think I'll be super high on it, but it's I don't think it'll creep onto my single entry 3 max builds, but it is something that I keep kind of playing around with.
So just one last game I wanted to touch on. I think it's interesting. I think it's the second highest scoring team in terms of points per game. I have not seen a bit of content on the San Francisco 49ers. And obviously, there are 10-point favorites. The problem is it's a very low good game total. They're playing a Cleveland team that will probably be starting PJ Walker. And the issue is that we would gravitate towards the running back and Christian McCaffrey, and he's incredibly expensive. Do you see yourself getting to any San Francisco players, or is it simply a matter of they're not going to score enough points to justify the price tag?
I mean, I think they could score enough points to justify the price tag because it's short fields and all of a sudden they've got 30 points, but then it's do they add the yards and the receptions, in PPR scoring? Do they pass enough for the yards and receptions to be added to the touchdowns for it to really be worth chasing there against a defense that ranks first in pass defense DVOA, third in run defense DVOA? I am not crossing the 49ers off my list, and that includes in single entry 3 max play. So yeah, I haven't found a way to gravitate toward them on rosters, but it's also well, here's a team that could score 35 points and people just won't be on them. So I think that's a very interesting spot.
That'll just about wrap it up. Any final thoughts for the week?
No, we didn't get to our hot takes. So
hot takes.
I got one. I just came up with it, as we were starting the show, but I'm going to say that that eventually people will be paying $6,700 for Adam Thielen, and they'll be happy to do it. So that's my it's $5,900, right? People it's hard to when the prices are going up, and he's a 32-year-old guy who looked pretty dusty last year. But yeah, I think his price tag still has room to go up.
It's another Dolphins run back.
There you go.
My hot takes are getting colder and colder as the season goes along. But I'll just say I think the Dolphins put up 35 points, 5 touchdowns, and lower their season scoring average from 36.2 down to 36 even.
I like it.
All right, that'll do it for week 6 of Solo Ship. Good luck to everybody, and we'll see you next week.